The water of the Yangtze does not flow so much as it churns, a heavy, silt-laden artery that has dictated the survival of empires for millennia. By the autumn of 1910, this river was the most valuable stretch of water on the planet. It was a chaotic, high-stakes highway where the industrial ambitions of the West collided with the fading grip of the Qing dynasty. On any given day, the river was a mosaic of movement: British steamships, German freighters, and thousands of traditional Chinese junks carrying everything from Sichuan silk to European coal. But in late October of that year, the movement stopped. The blockage began not with a crash or a storm, but with a series of quiet, seemingly unrelated delays. A freighter bound for Shanghai anchored near the mouth of the gorges, citing unfavorable conditions. Within 48 hours, 20 more vessels had dropped anchor behind it. By the end of the week, the number had swelled to over 400. 400 steel hulls, thousands of sailors, and millions of pounds in cargo sat motionless in a line that stretched for miles. To the observers on the shore, it looked like a city of iron had suddenly risen from the water. Logbooks from the British vessel SS H-Sign-Chi describe a chilling stillness that settled over the fleet. There was no wind, no rising tide to explain the hesitation of the lead pilots. For days, the world's most critical trade route was paralyzed. And yet, when we look at the official maritime records of the era, the cause of this massive logistical failure is curiously understated. Some reports blame a sudden, undocumented shift in the sandbars, while others point toward a coordinated strike by the local guilds. But as we look closer at the telegrams exchanged between the consulates in Hankou and the shipping offices in London, a different picture begins to emerge, one where the physical blockade was merely the symptom of something far more unsettling happening upstream. To understand why 400 ships would simply stop, one must understand the atmosphere of 1910. The world was on the precipice of a total transformation. In China, the imperial system was rotting from within, and the air was thick with the scent of impending revolution. Foreign powers had carved the country into spheres of influence, and the river was the only thing keeping the fragile peace. If the river stopped, the money stopped, and if the money stopped, the empires would fall. Records suggest that the initial halt was ordered by a local river warden, a man whose name has been scrubbed from most official histories. He reportedly signaled the lead ships to anchor, claiming that the passage ahead was no longer navigable. However, soundings taken by a French survey team just days earlier had shown the river was at its seasonal height. There was no physical reason for a blockage. And that's when things began to shift from a mere maritime delay into something that felt like a calculated disappearance of information. As the days turned into a week, the 400 ships became a floating powder keg. Provisions were running low. In the steerage decks of the passenger vessels, whispers began to circulate about what the lead pilots had seen further up the river. Some sailors claimed they saw a fleet of ghost junks unmanned and drifting, blocking the narrowest channels. Others spoke of a strange, rhythmic pulsing in the water that made the iron hulls of the steamships vibrate with a low, mournful hum. While these stories were likely the product of bored and frightened crews, the reaction of the authorities was undeniably real. The British Admiralty dispatched the HMS Nightingale to investigate the head of the line. The mission was straightforward: identify the obstruction, clear it, and get the tea and silk moving again. But when the Nightingale reached the point where the river bends toward the Ichang Hills, the crew found something that defied the logic of the era. The river wasn't blocked by silt, or by sunken ships, or by rebels. The water, according to the private diary of a junior officer on board, had simply changed. He wrote that the surface of the Yangtze had become as viscous as oil, and that the heavy coal-burning engines of the gunboat could not gain enough traction to push through the strangely thickened current. It was an observation that defied every known law of hydrology. And that wasn't the strangest part. As the Nightingale attempted to navigate this thickened water, the telegraph lines that ran parallel to the river, the primary nerves of the British Empire in China, went dead. One by one, the stations at Shaxi, Ichang, and Chongqing stopped responding. The blockade was no longer just a physical halt of ships, it was a total sensory blackout of the river valley. The 400 vessels were now trapped in a silent corridor, cut off from the world, waiting for a signal that would never come. In the offices of the China Navigation Company, panic was setting in. The financial loss of 400 ships sitting idle was enough to trigger a regional bank run. Pressure was placed on the Qing governors to intervene, but the imperial authorities seemed strangely paralyzed. Some historians believe the governors knew exactly what was happening upstream and were terrified of interfering. There is no clear consensus on what their internal communications contained, as most of the provincial archives from that month were burned during the revolution a year later. What we do have are the fragmented letters sent by passengers to their families, letters that were never mailed but were found years later in discarded trunks. One passenger, an American missionary named Elizabeth Thompson, wrote that the atmosphere among the anchored ships had turned heavy and expectant. She described watching the sunsets turn a bruised, metallic purple, and noted that the local wildlife, the porpoises and birds that usually filled the river, had completely vanished. "The river is waiting," she wrote on October 29th. "It feels as though the water itself is holding its breath." On the 8th day of the blockade, the lead ship, a German freighter named the Baden, finally broke the silence. It didn't send a telegram. It didn't blow its whistle. Instead, it began to move backward. Without turning its engines, without any visible assistance from the current, the massive ship began to drift upstream against the flow of the river. The vessels behind it watched in stunned silence as the Baden was pulled, as if by an invisible thread, into the misty shadows of the upper gorges. The captains of the remaining 399 ships were faced with an impossible choice: follow the Baden into the unknown, or remain anchored in a river that seemed to be losing its grip on reality. It was at this moment that the first reports of the light began to emerge. It was described as a faint, pale luminescence rising from the bed of the river, deep beneath the hulls of the ships. It wasn't the reflection of the moon or the glow of lanterns. It was something internal to the water itself. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. When a salvage crew was finally sent to the location where the Baden had been anchored, they found that the riverbed had been scorched. Under 20 feet of moving water, the stones were blackened and cracked, as if subjected to intense heat. There was no wreckage, no oil spill, and no sign of the Baden or its crew. The ship had simply been erased from the line. The disappearance of the Baden sent a shockwave through the anchored fleet, but the response from the maritime authorities was strangely muted. Instead of a frantic search and rescue operation, the British and Chinese officials issued a joint statement blaming a localized whirlpool and a mechanical failure. It was a tidy explanation that satisfied the newspapers in London and Berlin, but it did nothing to calm the thousands of sailors who had watched the 3,000-ton vessel defy the laws of physics. Among the remaining 399 ships, a hierarchy of fear began to take hold. The larger steamships, manned by European officers, maintained a veneer of discipline, while the hundreds of smaller Chinese junks began to vanish under the cover of night. They weren't moving upstream like the Baden, they were simply gone by morning, leaving behind empty moorings and a growing sense of abandonment. By November 1st, the blockade had physically thinned, but the tension had only intensified. It was during this period that a man named Arthur Vance, a low-level clerk for the Chinese Maritime Customs Service, was sent to the area to tally the remaining cargo. Vance was a meticulous record-keeper, and his surviving journals provide the most detailed account of what the authorities were trying to hide. As he moved from ship to ship, he noticed a recurring discrepancy in the manifests. Nearly a third of the vessels in the blockade were carrying heavy, lead-lined crates, listed simply as geological samples or mining equipment. Vance noted that these crates were not destined for the industrial centers of Shanghai or Wuhan. Their destination was much further inland beyond the gorges, into the remote, mountainous regions of Qinghai and Tibet. When Vance attempted to inspect one of these crates on a British freighter, he was stopped by a group of men who were not sailors, but private security contracted by an unknown firm. And that's when he realized the blockade wasn't an accident of nature or a strike by labor guilds. It was a containment measure. Records suggest that the ships carrying these specific crates were the ones positioned closest to the front of the line, the very ships that had first reported the viscous water and the low, rhythmic hum. There is no clear consensus on what these crates contained, but some historians believe they were part of a frantic, clandestine effort to remove unstable materials from the interior of China before the inevitable collapse of the Qing dynasty. But if the goal was to remove them, why stop the ships? Why keep them sitting in the middle of the river for weeks? The answer may lie in a discovery made by a team of divers sent by the China Navigation Company to inspect the hulls of the anchored ships. They found that the steel plates below the waterline were covered in a thick, translucent film that resembled organic growth, yet felt like cold glass. When they tried to scrape it off, the substance would reform within minutes. More disturbingly, the divers reported that the water at the bottom of the river was significantly warmer than the water at the surface. a thermal inversion that should have been impossible in a flowing river. As Vance continued his tally, he recorded a series of strange phenomena that the official reports ignored. He wrote of magnetic disturbances that rendered compasses useless, and of a strange metallic. But the most haunting detail in his journal concerns the crews themselves. He observed that men who had been on the river for decades were suddenly unable to remember their own names or the names of their ships. It was as if the river was eroding not just the land, but the memories of those who lived upon it. And that's when the narrative took its most violent turn. On the night of November 4th, a massive atmospheric event occurred over the Yangtze. Witnesses on the shore described a curtain of fire that seemed to descend from the clouds and touch the surface of the water. It wasn't lightning. There was no thunder, only a deafening, high-pitched whine that lasted for nearly 20 minutes. When the light faded, the blockade was no longer 399 ships. According to the morning report from the Ichang Customs House, the number of vessels had dropped to under 200 in a single night. There were no reports of sinkings. No debris was found floating downstream. The ships had simply ceased to be part of the line. The authorities quickly moved to seal off the area, declaring a quarantine zone due to an alleged outbreak of cholera. But the quarantine wasn't to keep a disease in, it was to keep witnesses out. In the confusion, Arthur Vance managed to slip away from his handlers and travel several miles upstream toward the heart of the viscous water zone. What he found there changed his understanding of the blockade entirely. In a small cove, he discovered 3 of the missing freighters, including the Baden. They weren't wrecked. They were perfectly intact, floating in a patch of water that was as smooth as a mirror. But there was no one on board. Vance described boarding the Baden and finding the mess hall set for dinner. The food was still on the plates, the tea was still warm in the pots, and the lamps were still lit. But of the 60-man crew, there was no sign. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, and no indications of a hurried evacuation. It was as if the crew had been plucked from the ship in a single heartbeat. He moved to the bridge, hoping to find the captain's log. What he found instead was a series of coordinates scribbled across the charts in a frantic, shaky hand. They weren't maritime coordinates. They were astronomical. Beside them was a single sentence, repeated over and over until the ink ran dry. The river is not the path. While Vance's account has been dismissed by some as the product of a mind broken by heat and stress, it aligns with a series of peculiar telegrams sent by the German consulate during the same week. The telegrams, which remained classified for 80 years, spoke of unexplained mass desertions and spatial anomalies along the upper Yangtze. The German government was less concerned with the loss of the Baden and more concerned with what the ship had encountered, something they referred to in their codes as the silt gate. The concept of a gate, or a specific point of transition in the river, appears in several local legends from the Hubei province, but it had never been taken seriously by Westerners. These legends spoke of a hidden current that only appeared when the stars and the tides were in perfect alignment, a current that did not lead to the sea, but to a version of the river that existed alongside our own. As the midpoint of November approached, the remaining ships of the blockade were finally given the order to move. But they weren't ordered forward. They were ordered to turn back, to abandon their cargo, and to return to their ports of origin immediately. It was an unprecedented move in the history of global trade. Millions of pounds of goods were simply left to rot or be looted. But as the ships began their retreat, the river gave up one final mystery. A British scout vessel, the HMS Woodcock, reported seeing a fleet of ships far more than the original 400 moving silently through the fog in the opposite direction. They were of all eras and all designs, ancient wooden junks, modern ironclads, and ships that the captain of the Woodcock could not even identify. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace, and they made no sound as they passed. What happened next remains unclear, as the official logs of the Woodcock for that day were later lost in transit to the Admiralty. But we do know that when the blockade finally cleared on November 20th, the Yangtze was a different river. The sandbars had shifted in ways that defied geological explanation, and the water, once brown and thick with silt, was, for a brief period, as clear as the open ocean. The world's attention soon shifted to the revolution of 1911, and the mystery of the 1910 blockade was buried under the weight of a collapsing empire. But for those who survived it, the questions never went away. Why did the water thicken? Where did the crews go? And what was being carried in those lead-lined crates? Evidence suggests that the answers were known to a select few, but those individuals took their secrets to the grave, or perhaps into the river itself. By December 1910, the river had returned to its natural state, but the world that relied upon it had been permanently altered. The 400 ships that had once formed a solid wall across the Yangtze were scattered. Most had retreated to the safety of the coastal treaty ports, their captains refusing to speak of the weeks spent in the viscous water. The insurance claims filed in the wake of the blockade were staggering, yet almost all of them were settled out of court, often with non-disclosure agreements that remained in effect for nearly a century. The immediate aftermath was characterized by a frantic, bureaucratic effort to erase the event from the public consciousness. In the British Parliament, questions regarding the Yangtze stoppage were met with vague references to unusual tidal bores and regional instability. In Germany, the Kaiser's Admiralty simply listed the Baden as lost at sea due to boiler explosion, despite there being no evidence of a wreck. But the silence of the archives was not the end of the story. In the decades that followed, the 1910 blockade became a whispered legend among the river pilots of the Yangtze. They spoke of the October stillness as a period when the river had judged the world's empires. But beyond the folklore, there were physical remnants that refused to disappear. In 1923, during an exceptionally low tide near the Jilin Gorge, a group of local fishermen discovered a series of massive, lead-lined crates wedged into the limestone cliffs, hundreds of feet above the current water level. There was no clear consensus on how the crates had reached such a height. Some historians believe they were hoisted there by the Qing military during the chaos of the blockade, while others suggest a more jarring possibility that the river level had briefly and violently surged to impossible heights during the Curtain of Fire event. When the crates were opened by local authorities, they were found to be empty, save for a fine, iridescent dust that caused skin irritation and led to the immediate sealing of the site. The records of this discovery were buried during the Second Sino-Japanese War, but the mystery resurfaced in the late 20th century. As China began the monumental task of constructing the Three Gorges Dam, the river's bed was subjected to the most intense scientific scrutiny in history. Engineers used advanced sonar and sub-bottom profiling to map the silt layers, looking for stable foundations for the dam's massive piers. In 1994, a survey team for the project stumbled upon something that should have been impossible. Deep beneath the sediment of the 1910 layer, they identified a series of large, metallic anomalies. They were shaped like the hulls of early 20th century freighters, but they were positioned vertically, as if they had been driven into the riverbed like nails. When the team attempted to send remote-operated vehicles to investigate, the equipment suffered catastrophic electrical failure. And that wasn't the strangest part. The sonar data from that specific sector showed a ghosting effect, a second, identical set of readings that appeared to be moving, even though the objects on the riverbed were stationary. Some engineers suggested it was a glitch in the software, but the lead surveyor, in a private report that was leaked years later, noted that the anomalies seemed to pulse at a frequency that matched the low, rhythmic hum described by the sailors in 1910. This modern re-examination has led some researchers to reconsider the viscous water phenomenon. Some believe that the Yangtze flows over a series of unique geological fault lines that, under specific atmospheric conditions, can release massive amounts of localized gases or electromagnetic energy. This could, in theory, alter the density of the water and interfere with telegraph lines. But it doesn't explain the disappearance of the crews, or the Baden moving against the current. What happened next remains unclear, as the construction of the Three Gorges Dam eventually flooded the entire area under hundreds of feet of water. The sites of the 1910 blockade, the scorched riverbed, and the vertical wrecks are now lost to the depths of a man-made reservoir. The pressure of the water above has silenced the river's secrets, perhaps forever. There is a final, haunting detail from the journal of Arthur Vance that has only recently gained significance. In his final entry, written as he watched the last of the blockade ships disappear into the fog, he noted that the river did not seem to be flowing toward the sea anymore. He felt as though the entire valley had become a closed loop, a place where time and distance had lost their meaning. "We are not leaving the river," Vance wrote. "The river is leaving us." Today, as modern cargo ships navigate the controlled waters of the Three Gorges, the 1910 blockade is a footnote in maritime history, often dismissed as a combination of labor unrest and environmental anomaly. Yet, the questions persist. We have the logs of the 400 ships, the records of the viscous water, and the classified telegrams of three empires. But the core of the event, the why behind the sudden paralysis of the world's greatest trade route, remains a void. Did the river simply reach a breaking point, Was the 1910 blockade a warning of the global upheaval that would follow in the coming years? Or was it, as the local legends suggest, a moment where the hidden current became visible, drawing ships and men into a geography we are not yet meant to understand? The Yangtze continues to flow, carrying the weight of 1 billion lives and the history of 1,000 years. It is a silent witness to the empires that rise and fall along its banks. But every so often, when the fog is thick and the current is still, the old pilots say you can still hear it, the low, metallic hum of 400 ships, waiting for a signal that the world is finally ready to move forward. The archives may be closed, the witnesses may be gone, and the evidence may be buried under 1 billion tons of water. But the river remembers. And for now, that remains the only answer we are permitted to find.